Is it possible to reverse Alzheimer's? You would think that if it was possible to reverse Alzheimer's, that everyone would know about it. But the reason that it's not well known is because there's not a great way to make a lot of money. If it was a drug or pill, there would be millions of dollars spent in advertising, and you'd be sure to know about it. But there's research dating back even as early as the 1990s, which supports how, and there are many instances which I'll go through, of how these treatments have reversed the effects of Alzheimer's. I was surprised when I came upon it. I was very skeptical, but I will go through it and you can decide for yourself. So, the bulk of what I'm going to talk about is from a doctor named Dale Breedson, and he's out of UCLA. He's a professor there, and he was chief resident of neurology at UC San Francisco. So, this is not just some strange fellow. This is someone who's got the credentials. And this is important because Alzheimer's is the third leading cause of death in America. And so, if there's a way to treat it, maybe people should know about it. Okay. So, the strategy that this doctor came up with is called metabolic enhancement for neurodegeneration. He calls it MEND. And I'm going to talk about 10 patients. All these patients were tested, and they all were seen to have Alzheimer's disease or some other cognitive impairment. And they say that 9 improved, although it seems like all 10 improved. And then there I have cases in part 2 of this video, which will be more cases on top of that. Now, could he have cherry-picked these cases and ignored the other cases? I don't know. It's certainly possible. We'd have to know for sure. But I think that someone with this level of reputation is unlikely to do that. And there's lots of other research besides his. And I even talk about some other treatments as well. Okay, so what are we talking about? What are these treatments? Well, it's not a drug. The MEND protocol is about 24 holistic interventions. And the patients can do as many as they can. They can start with few and increase it. That's some of the cases you'll see. And we'll detail what those actual treatments are in 2 and 3. But again, as I mentioned, I have a close friend who is a neurologist, and he spent 20 years well paid to test out Alzheimer's drugs. And he tells me none of them work. And these drugs are going to keep coming, and we're going to keep saying there's no cure because they don't, the people who want to make money off of this aren't going to talk about this stuff. But if we did a large study, the way they can fund these large studies, I think it would back up what he has with these small studies. Again, I'm just presenting the evidence. I'm not trying to convince anybody of anything. I'm just sharing with you what I have learned. Okay, so basically a non-pharmaceutical way to reverse Alzheimer's, supported in this peer-reviewed studies. This should be front page news. It is, but it isn't on the front page. But again, because there's no PR mechanism or machine pushing it forth. So I'm making this video and I'm sharing the presentation with anyone who's interested in getting it. So now this is important to you, perhaps, if you're like me and in your 50s or older, because what's going on is that a drug takes an average of 12 years to be approved by the FDA. And so there's no miracle drug on the horizon now. And so you're 12 years away from getting any kind of treatment. So if you're starting to see signs, or if you have a relative who has dementia or Alzheimer's, and you're in your 40s, but let's say your 50s or older, then you're going to see this is you can't wait. Basically, you're out of time. So now the other reason is that drugs in general are often requiring you to have very precise dosages. This system that he developed or discovered, I'm not sure how it all came about, but each patient was doing different dosages and different treatments, and this would drive a very linear thinker crazy because it's hard to measure which one is doing it and how much should I take. So you have to have a different kind of mindset to appreciate this kind of research. But it's not precise dosages. You do what you can. And often when you go to a doctor, you're only going to get a prescription when you're showing symptoms. So this, if it in fact is helping, you may be pre-symptomatic, but you're at high risk. And this is all healthy stuff I'm going to talk about. So you can just take it and you don't get dementia, and you won't even know whether it's because you did what I told you to do or what he told you to do. I'll add a few things to his. Anyway, also drugs are expensive. So when and if they discover that miracle drug, it will be a lot of money. And sometimes it can't solve issues, right? Drugs can't always solve the issues, and often they have side effects. And that's not to say, some of these medications that I'm going to talk about, whether they're herbal remedies, if you take too many of them, you can have a problem. So you want to just keep to the dosage that's written on the side of the bottle. And you can also, of course, talk to your doctor about all of this. Okay, so some of them, as I said, are kind of herbal remedies, but I'll go into the research behind it. Don't get scared; it's herbal remedies. But here's what happened: 9 of the 10 cases had metabolic changes to the brain. They did MRI studies so they could see what is actually happening, and these weren't just subjective people reporting, "Oh, this is how I feel. This is how my spouse is different." They did cognitive testing. These were done by trained personnel. So you have objective measures. Okay, so and let's just talk about one of them. Increased size of the hippocampus. That's where your memories are located. That got bigger. Another patient, this MFI score was at 230, and that's what's typical for a patient with dementia. But after doing the treatment for a few months, it went to 1100 and then stabilized to over 1000 for the year that they collected data. So again, this person had a diagnosis of dementia, of Alzheimer's, and was not responding to medication. And their score on the mini mental improved to a perfect 30. Okay, so let's talk about what these cases are. And this largely comes from this study done by Dr. Breedson. Okay, so here's the first patient. These images I'm going to show you are not real people. This is generated by a computer that just takes an amalgam of thousands of photos and puts them together. So these are not real people. But I felt it's important to show a picture of somebody just so you reference that these are human beings. Unless, of course, he made this all up. But again, it's peer-reviewed, and he has a huge reputation. I just don't think he's going to do that. So this first person, 66-year-old, he was forgetting appointments, and it was hard for him to perform his job. And he had dementia. Both of his parents had dementia. So he began the MEN protocol, and again, I'll detail those in parts 2 and parts 3, and then maybe a part 4. And on this, he lost 18 pounds because he's eating better. And after 3 months, his wife reported that his memory had improved, and he noted that his work had come more easily to him. Now, this is the interesting part, and I think the reason why Dr. Breedson put this first. This particular patient, after 5 months, he stopped doing it. Most of it. And he stopped for 3 weeks. And guess what happened? His wife found him in the house, and the car was in the driveway, and he had left it on. The keys were in the ignition. He was completely forgotten that he had done that in only 3 weeks, going off the program. Then he went back on the program, obviously, got motivated, and he had no further episodes. And so, he was the case where you saw a dramatic increase in hippocampal volume. Not the only one, but this is sort of the objective evidence that neurologists are looking for, and this happened. And I'll talk about what are some of the things he did. Okay, here's patient number 2. Again, this is not the person. 69-year-old, professional, 11 years of slowly progressive memory loss, and then it accelerated in the past 1 or 2 years. Had a PET scan, pattern typical for Alzheimer's disease. So he was given the advice, you have Alzheimer's disease, and this progression's been going on for years, and you should get your affairs in order. And he starts to shut down his business. And then, luckily for him, he began the MEN program. So here's what happened in 6 months. Wife, coworkers all noted improvement. Lost 10 pounds. He could recognize faces better, which he was not able to do. He could remember his daily schedule. He was able to function without difficulty. He was quicker with his responses. He used to be able to add up all these numbers in a column. He got that back. So this is what happened. So his decline was accelerating, and now suddenly, not only is it not accelerating, he's getting abilities back that he had before. Then after 2 years on the protocol, so they followed him a longer time, his neuropsychological testing improved dramatically. And the neuropsych who performed that said that this improvement was something that the person had not seen in 30 years of practice. Okay, so let's move on to patient 3. Again, not the person, late 50s. She began noting she was forgetting things like coming back home from shopping without the items that she had purchased. And she was at 35th percentile. So she was better than 35% of people and not as good as 65% of people. And she had been a great student earlier in life. So she began the MEN protocol. And guess what? She went up to 98th percentile. And it's remained there as of the time of the paper after 3.5 years. Patient 4, again, not the person, 49-year-old female, progressive difficulty with word finding. Her vocabulary is becoming limited, unsure about navigation, where she was during driving, difficulty of facial recognition, more energy required to recall things, and she was having trouble remembering scheduled events. Clarity and sharpness were reduced, so she couldn't help her kids with their homework, and she had difficulty with conversations that got complex and with reading comprehension, and she used to be able to speak 2 foreign languages. Family history was positive, with her father had dementia, Alzheimer's. So she began to mend, and over the next few months, clear improvement in recall, reading, navigating, vocabulary, mental clarity, facial recognition, foreign language abilities returned. 9 months later, same location, she was tested again, no evidence of cognitive decline. Immediate and delayed recall, semantic knowledge, that's your vocabulary, executive function, processing speed, all had improved. Okay, let's go keep going. Again, not the person. 55-year-old woman, memory concerns for 2 years, and her aunt and grandmother had dementia. Difficulties with word recall a few times a day, so she wanted to say tweezers. She wanted to say tongs, but she'd say tweezers. Okay, so increased spelling errors. She had been a professional writer and editor, master's degree. Obviously was bothering her. She lost her train of thought while she was speaking, forgetting what she had just said. She'd lose items, forget why she walked into a room. She'd forget things her husband told her to do or asked her to do, or told her about or asked her to do. She began the MEND protocol, and after 4 months, the husband noted her memory has improved. She noted she could recall words as good as that ability was as good as it ever had been, and she was no longer experiencing the spelling errors. She rarely lost her train of thought. If she went off on a tangent or something interrupted her, the issue would return, but she'd pause, give herself a few seconds, and then she could go back to her original train of thought. She no longer forgot why she entered a room, and she rarely misplaced items. And her primary doctor said her cognition had returned to normal after 4 months on the protocol. And so let's look at some testing. Online cognitive testing performed at the start of the protocol and then after 5 months. So she went from the general composite 16th to 73rd. The composite memory from 1st percentile to 61st percentile. Verbal memory 3rd percentile, meaning 97% of people were better than her, to 93rd percentile, meaning only 7% of people were better than her. Visual memory went from 5th percentile to 14th percentile. Executive function went from 14th percentile to 58th percentile, so now she's kind of in the middle instead of being near the bottom. And processing speed went from 37th percentile to, up at the top there, 81st percentile. That's extremely dramatic. There's no pill I know of that can do that. 74-year-old, this is the next patient, 74-year-old man, is 5 years of memory loss and word finding. Began the MEND protocol. Again, this MFI was measured at 1260. Normal is over than 500. And his MMSE was 29. So he really had a dramatic improvement. And 3 months later, he was at 30 and his MFI was 1200. So this patient, he returned 3 months after that. So what happened, he went on a trip. He got stressed. He'd gone off much of the protocol. His memory, he felt, had declined. So his MFI dropped down to 230, which is a typical score, again, as you know, for Alzheimer's disease. And his MMSE was no longer perfect 30. It was now 28. So he's placed back on the protocol 2 months later, back up to an MFI of 1100 and MMSE of 30. And over 12 months, he stayed on the protocol, and his MFI remained above 1,000. His MMSE remained at 30. So you can say, it's a coincidence, but there's 2 different cases where that same thing happens. They go off it, they lose the ability, they go back on it, they gain the ability back. Okay, patient number 7. Again, this is not the person. This is an image created by the computer. 57-year-old man. He began to have difficulty with memory and work performance, so he lost his job. Over the next 5 years, cognition continued to decline. He developed navigational difficulties, difficulty with attention, multitasking. He just became quieter and less self-assured. And this guy had been a great guitarist, and he lost the chord progression memory and the nuance in his playing, and his mom had dementia. So he went on the MEND protocol. Wife noticed his memory and navigation improved, and guess what? His guitar skills improved, his chord progressions and the nuances. and he was able to play several pieces for the neurologist. Now, this patient had well-documented Alzheimer's disease, characteristic presentation, behavior, abilities, characteristic PET scan, APOE4 homozygous. So for 7 years prior to beginning the MEN protocol, his cognition had been going down. Again, that's how Alzheimer's goes, right? It's progressive. It's highly unlikely that his MMSE would improve from 22 to 26 and then to 29 over 10 months. If any drug could do that, you would know about it because it would be advertised all over the place. So there you go. Patient number 8, 68-year-old businessman. This is not him. Executive. He was an executive. He presented with a 5-year history of progressive memory loss, forcing him to retire from his company. He had difficulty navigating while driving as well. Family history, positive. His mother had dementia. Following MEN, both he and his family noted improvement in memory and navigation. This was documented by online neuropsych testing, and he showed an increase from 0 at the baseline to 2,221, so he got to the 52nd percentile. Patient number 9, again, not the person, at age 54, she began having word-finding difficulty, disorientation, difficulty driving, difficulty following recipes and other instructions, memory complaints, and these became worse and worse. She became quieter, slower to respond. PET scan, typical for Alzheimer's, placed on the MEN protocol. They also gave her a vasoactive intestinal peptide. So after 3 months, she was able to babysit her grandchildren. She could follow written instructions, verbal instructions. She couldn't do that before. She was able to read and remember overnight, discuss the reading with her husband, which she had not been able to do before. She also routinely remembered events of the previous day, which had not occurred in the few years prior to treatment. Moving on to patient number 10. So you see, they all had improvements in this one too. So I'm not quite sure why his paper says 9 out of 10. But anyway, okay. So she was a 54-year-old woman, 2-year history of memory loss. She did not retain new information the way she formerly did. She had to reread things a number of times, especially if it was technical or scientific, and her speed of reading had gone down. She noted a reduction in vocabulary, word-finding problems, repeated use of the same word instead of using synonyms, which, that makes us sound more natural when we speak. She noted increased difficulty with grammar, spelling, loss of names of friends and famous people. Her writing declined. Her she had typos. She had difficulty remembering passwords. She had increased difficulty driving, organizing, and with motivation. So here's where her tests were. She had 32nd percentile for composite memory, visual memory at 10th percentile, meaning 90% of people are better, and verbal memory at 73rd percentile. So she was doing well there. The composite memory score went to 61%, so that's nearly double. The visual memory score went to 25%, more than double, and the verbal score just went up 10%, but she was already pretty strong there. After 4 months, that was only after 4 months, and so her verbal memory improvement was modest, but Alzheimer's is supposed to be progressive, and she had homozygosity, so should have been progressive, but actually got better. And maybe given more than 4 months, things were getting better. So all these patients met the criteria for Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive impairment, but they failed to meet but then after you gave them the treatment, they failed to meet the criteria for Alzheimer's disease or mild cognitive treatment, hence reversal. That happened. Following treatment, most have returned to the normal range for their cognitive testing, and we saw with patient number 1 and the other patient 2 also that when they stopped, they dripped, and when they went back on, they went back up. Now, the paper by Dr. Breedson says we don't know how long these will be sustained, but they've been doing some follow-ups for 4 years. So again, all these patients had the criteria. So it's been claimed that there's nothing that will prevent, delay, or reverse Alzheimer's disease, right? So people don't test for the APOE genotype, because that's the most important risk factor, but no need to test for it, right? And if you don't have symptoms, definitely don't test for it. But these examples suggest that's not true. That if we can actually prevent and reverse it, everyone should be tested for it. I have no stock in any companies that test for that genotype, but and the thing is, you could just go on this protocol, which I'll share in the later parts, and then you don't even have to necessarily go through the expense of getting tested. You just assume that you have the genotype. If you have a relative, particularly, if you just assume you have it, go on the protocol, and as you can see, if you're like these 10 people, and others I will share with you later in other parts, you're going to see presumably some improvement. So you have 75 million Americans who are heterozygous, and approximately 7 million are homozygous. So early identification could have a major impact on lowering this. And the baby boomers are coming, so this is happening. We really don't have time to wait. The drug companies had their decades and they didn't come up with it, so we got to go somewhere else. Okay, so I'm going to stop there, and then I'll move on to part 2 in a separate video. Thank you for listening, and email me if you have any questions.